Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us for Ending the Charter School Wars. And thank you to everyone who's here with us in DC today. And I also want to extend a warm welcome to anyone who's watching online. And whether you're online or in the room, we encourage you to participate throughout the event. If you tweet, we're having conversation on Twitter. Just use the hashtag #SmarterCharter. My name is Hallie Potter. I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation with our education team. And to give you a little background on the Century Foundation, TCF is a progressive think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. And education is really a key part of that work for us. Education should be the path for upward mobility in this country, but too often, as we know, the options for rich and poor are separate and unequal. TCF's work in education focuses on finding more ways to provide students from all backgrounds with access to the same high-quality educational opportunities. And our work on charter schools explores how these schools can be a part of that solution to addressing educational inequality. Which charter school models work best? Should we be channeling resources to charter schools that serve the most low-income and minority students? What role should teachers play in determining how charter schools are run? How can we better leverage the work that charter schools are doing to help the 95% of students who are in traditional public schools? We're delighted and honored to have with us here today KIPP, a charter school network which operates 162 schools across the country, serving 58,000 students, 88% of whom are low income. And today's conversation will also draw from a book that my colleague Richard Collenberg and I have written, A Smarter Charter. Let's see a copy. In our book, we profile 15 different charter school networks that are in certain ways very different from KIPP's model. We have postcards in the back if you're interested in getting a copy of the book. And I am so thrilled to be able to introduce our moderator today. We have Thomas Talk with us. Tom is a senior partner at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and a director of the Foundation's Washington office. He's a founder and former co-director of the think tank Education Sector, a former guest scholar at Brookings. He's taught at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he helped launch Education Week in the 1980s. He spent a decade as the senior education correspondent at U.S. News and World Report and has also contributed to a number of other publications. His work has twice been nominated for National Magazine Awards, and he's the author of 2 books on American education, In the Name of Excellence and High Schools on a Human Scale. I really can't imagine a better moderator. We are so glad to have you, Tom. I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our panelists and get our discussion started.
Good. Thanks a lot, Hallie. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. I want to also thank Steve Mancini of KIPP and Lucy Muirhead of Century for their good work in making this event possible. And I want to thank our colleagues in the education program at KAPP for providing such a great space for this conversation today. So thanks. I don't think there's any argument that charter schools have had a dramatic impact on the landscape in American education since their inception in 1992. They have provided many new educational options for students and their families. They have provided new educational models, innovative designs, and they have attracted to a profession that has traditionally not drawn the best and the brightest, public schooling, a very talented cadre of social entrepreneurs over the past 2 decades. And in addition, they have brought to bear pressure on the traditional public schools, forced them to compete for students, and in so doing incentivize them to improve. But the other side of the coin is that there are serious questions about the quality and fiscal accountability of a number of charter schools, of many charter schools. And 2 decades after the inception of the concept, there are lingering questions about the roles and responsibilities of charter schools as public institutions. And it's really the latter that we are going to turn your mic on, she said. Sorry. Yours is okay. Oh. I thought he did turn mine on.
I've got mine on. Richard?
Mine on?
Yep.
Everybody, we okay now? Okay. So these challenges around the question of roles and responsibilities as public institutions are real. And those are the topics that Hallie and Rick Kallenberg, I'm going to call Richard Rick and Richard Richard in order to avoid confusion. And these are the topics of our conversation today. And we're really fortunate to be able to have 2 very thoughtful experts on charter schooling to be with us to have this conversation, which I hope you all will become part of after we talk together for a little while. Hallie's co-author, Rick Kallenberg, to my far left, is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He's also, and I don't know if you all know this, but he's also one of the foremost liberal voices in American education. He is an articulate advocate of class-based affirmative action and a supporter of teacher unionism. He has authored 6 books, including a memoir of his time at Harvard Law School and a comprehensive biography of Al Shanker that many of you have read, I'm sure, entitled Tough Liberal. He has edited 10 volumes of essays over 15 years at Century on school choice, affirmative action, and education's role in social mobility. He writes frequently for the New York Times and other publications, and he's a peripatetic television commentator as well. And at other points in his career, he's been a visiting associate professor of constitutional law, at GW University and a legislative assistant to former U.S. Senator Chuck Robb, the Virginia Democrat. To help us explore the topics in Smarter Charter and give us some balance as to where we are coming from in higher education. We have another Harvard graduate, Richard Barth. That was a joke. Sorry, I didn't do it very well. I'm sorry. Richard, as many of you know, is the CEO of the KIPP Foundation, which is one of the largest, highest performing and best known nonprofit charter networks in the country. In the 8 years that Richard has led the organization, it has nearly quadrupled in size to 162 schools, educating 59,000 students. And this past summer, at KIPP's 20th anniversary event in Houston, Richard announced that he hopes to double the size of the network again by 2020, within 5 years or so. Richard, I think it's important to note, is a leading representative of a generation of socially conscious entrepreneurs drawn to public education over the past 2 decades. He was a founding leader of Teach for America and spent 6 years in the school operations division of Chris Whittle's for-profit Edison schools before becoming KIPP's chief executive in 2006. And among the many sort of awards or the many types of recognition that he has received for his good work as a social entrepreneur, the Schwab Foundation this year named Richard its Social Entrepreneur of the Year, and Harvard invited him to be the chief marshal for the university's 2014 commencement ceremonies. He told us in the green room that it's his 25th anniversary.
I went very young.
So we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I would love for all of you to join the conversation, because I think the topics will be interesting, engaging, and your perspectives will be important to it. Let me start with Richard, if I could, and just get a sense of why you are doing charter school work, and then give us a sense of what you see to be KIPP's mission.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks to everyone at Century for having us here. It's hugely exciting to be able to join you all. I want to thank just Rick and Hallie for writing a really good book. And I said this earlier, it's actually really easy to read. So I just encourage, I read it last night, kids running around, and it's not everything you pick up is easy to read. And this book is not just a good book, but it's a really straightforward articulation of, I think, in some ways, the history of charters, and also turns in the evolution of the movement. So why do I do what I do? Super quickly, there are so many kids in America, 13, 14, 15 million children growing up in communities where they don't really have access to a great education. And everyone in this room knows we're in this era of globalization, where your educational attainment is actually the make or break factor in whether you're going to participate in today's world as a member of society, as someone who's able to live a life of choice. So that's why I've been in this work for 25 years, and it's a great blessing to be able to do what I do. Let me do a quick thing on KIPP, our mission, and then just why I wanted to join you today. On our mission, KIPP is now, as Tom just said, it's 20 years old. We celebrate our 20th anniversary this summer from the creation of the first KIPP program, which was a 5th grade program, founded by 2 teachers, Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin, in Houston, Texas. Our mission is to build a national network of public schools, preparing young people in our nation's most challenging communities for a life of choice, for success in college and a life with options. That's our mission. And as Tom said, we now have 162 schools across the country. Over the last several years, we've moved beyond just our core middle school model, which was our founding approach, to now being really a K through 12 network of schools. We have now opened 60 elementary schools and 22 high schools. So that's what we're aiming to do. 59,000 students today. 5-6 years ago, we had several hundred KIPPsters, as we call our kids, in college. Just this year alone, 2,500 went off to college this summer. I wanted to come here today because I think, and I want everyone to know, we're a learning organization, and I think this movement we're a part of is a learning movement. And so the least we can do is to engage in the kind of discussion we're going to have today. This is a good book. It's thought-provoking, and we'll keep getting better at what we do as a result of having these conversations. Last thing I'd say is I come here today because I thought the heading, whoever came up with it, ending the charter wars, I'm really optimistic about where the whole effort that we're all a part of is going in terms of opportunities for kids. And I don't wake up in the morning and tell my 4 children that I'm going off to war. I think we've had enough of war and the use of that term. And so I think just talking about how we're creating a better future for more kids in this country is where I hope this dialogue is going. So glad to be here.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Rick, you and Hallie wrote Smarter Charter in response to objections that you have with the direction of the movement, I think it's fair to say, reflected in part by KIPP. Could you share with us what those objections are?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Tom, for suggesting that we do this discussion. I've been really looking forward to it, and thank you, Richard, for coming down from New York. So there was so much for me to agree with in what you said, Richard. I think we're all in this field because we care about making sure that more poor kids have access to an excellent education. And I have a tremendous amount of admiration for the work that the KIPP has been doing. And if you look at the test score results of KIPP students nationally, they're really off the charts. I reviewed a book a number of years ago that Jay Matthews wrote on KIPP, and he made the point that this is an institution or set of schools that is making more progress with more low-income students than anyone has done before. So I celebrate what KIPP has been doing with 60,000 students. Having said that, I'm also concerned, as I know Richard is, about the millions of low-income students who are trapped in failing schools. Many of them high poverty charter schools, high poverty traditional schools. If you look, for example, in DC at the way charter schools rank, if you look at those that are in the bottom tier, 4 out of 5 are high poverty charter schools. So Hallie and I wrote the book because we thought we should try to expand the conversation of what charter schools can be and what they might look like in order to reach more kids. The original inspiration came from Al Shanker, who proposed charter schools back in 1988 at the National Press Club, and there were 3 pillars behind his idea. The first was that charter schools should be institutions that cooperate with the traditional public school system. They should be laboratories where you would try out new ideas and new things, and then those lessons would be transferred to the traditional public schools with the insight that even today charter schools are only 5% of the educate 5% of public school students, and so really the big leverage here is what lessons charter schools can impart to traditional public schools. That's where the big action is. The second pillar of Shanker's vision was that teachers had to have a lot of voice. That if you want experimentation, you should tap into the expertise of rank and file teachers who have so much to offer. And unfortunately, at most charter schools are not really involved in the running of schools. So Al Shanker wanted charter schools to be unionized, but then furthermore, he wanted teachers to have a lot of say in how the schools were run. There's a lot of research behind this idea. Richard Ingersoll at University of Pennsylvania and others have talked about the ways in which teacher voice can enhance the education for students. And then finally, the third pillar was the idea that charter schools were uniquely positioned to be socioeconomically and racially integrated, right? You can put a charter school anywhere. You do not have to draw only the kids who can afford to live in a certain neighborhood to that charter school. And so the early advocates, looking at 50 years of research, suggested that this was a great opportunity to provide an integrated environment for students, racially and economically. And unfortunately, most charter schools are more segregated than traditional public schools, which is a kind of difficult thing to be. I mean, our traditional public schools are already highly segregated, and a number of studies have found that the charter schools are more socioeconomically segregated. And that's troubling Hallie and I because there's this research going back 50 years to suggest that low-income students will do much better on average in economically integrated schools. High-poverty schools are 22 times less likely to be high-performing as middle-class schools. Low-income kids who have a chance to go to middle-class schools are as much as 2 years ahead of low-income kids stuck in high-poverty schools on the National Assessment for Educational Progress in Math. So we think the charter school idea is very exciting. There's some we profile 15 schools in our book, places like Denver School of Science and Technology, which is having great results with student integration. Schools like Green Dot, charter schools like Green Dot that have given teachers a lot of say in how the school is run and have exciting results. So we'd like, we celebrate what KIPP is doing and want to see that continue. But we think in addition, there should be in the conversation a role for these economically and racially integrated charter schools that really take advantage of the expertise of teachers.
Fair enough, thanks. Let's talk a little bit about teacher voice. You suggest that the absence, a systematic absence of teacher voice in many charters, you're not focused on KIPP for sure, but across the sector, you suggest there is a systematic absence of teacher voice and that it's contributing to what you describe as an epidemic of teacher turnover. Can you just sort of give us a little more insight into your thinking on that?
Yeah. Well, I think there are 3 reasons that we want to have more teacher voice in the charter sector than we do today. I mean, right now, teachers, only 7% of teachers in charter schools are unionized. And there, as you say, there's high teacher turnover. Why is that bad? Well, first of all, we're losing out on the great ideas that teachers could offer to improve charter schools and traditional public schools. I mean, that's just kind of management 101. I mean, if you look at a place like Google, they have a flat system. They want to tap into the expertise of rank and file people. And so that's one reason that this lack of teacher voices is of concern. The second is, as you mentioned, much higher rates of teacher turnover in charter schools. The classic view on this is that if you don't give individuals voice, they will exit. And that's what happens in charter schools much more than in traditional public schools. And that's of concern because kids are affected, right? When there's a lot of teacher turnover in a school, there's less stability. Schools end up wasting a lot of money trying to hire new teachers, and that's of concern. The third thing I'd say, Tom, is that the fact that teachers lack voice and the fact that charter schools are not generally open or welcoming to unions really inhibits this critical role of charters in transferring lessons to the traditional public schools. Steve Barr talks about this, the founder of the Green Dot schools, that if you look at a system that is a public school system that's overwhelmingly unionized, and then try to create this side group that is almost entirely non-unionized, there will naturally be a lot of animosity between the two groups, and the ability to transfer the lessons from charter schools to traditional public schools is deeply diminished. So for those 3 reasons, we have concerns.
Thanks. So before I ask Richard to respond, are you suggesting that it is the absence of collective bargaining in charter schools that diminishes teacher voice, or is it something broader than that? What's the source of the
Right.
diminution of voice?
Yeah, so the way Shanker saw it, and I think he's backed up by the research, is that you would want the charter schools to be unionized because that's a strong way to make sure that teachers' concerns are heard. But then you'd want to take it even to a higher level and give teachers even more say, experiment with giving teachers more say in deciding who gets hired, who gets fired, what the curriculum should look like. And so this is really a missed opportunity in the charter sector.
Richard, teacher voice. How do you see it? Is it important? Does it exist in charters? And conversely, is it lacking? Do you think?
So I won't speak to all charters because
Sure.
I just don't know. But let me just speak to KIPP, and there's some things I'll agree on, and then I might just throw out some things as food for thought. So teacher voice matters for sure. And I would just say, whether you have research on it or just you go to schools or you are a human being, you get that people want a voice in how their life works. And I would say the generation that's coming up, if any of you have worked with them, like it's, we all have to be ready for that because they want to have a lot of voice even relative to prior generations. So it's hugely important. And in the book, Rick shares that they really want to have voice on things like instruction. They want to have voice in how the whole organization is operating, how it works. So not just their classroom instruction, but organization-wide. They want to have, be able to talk about conditions, and that conditions affect the conditions that teachers feel affect kids. I agree with all that. So I just want to say, like, big reasons. Second thing, I agree, you don't want high turnover because it's hugely exhausting and inefficient to have high turnover because you're investing a lot in teacher development and growth. So if you make all that, if you're really committed to teacher professional development, you really want to see people stay. And you want people to stay, honestly, because relationships really matter. And so people, when they get to know kids and families, that becomes a huge benefit to a school over time. So I agree with all the reasons why you want this, and I also agree that teachers want to be able to be engaged in this. So what is our experience? So I would say, I think, and this is where I'm going to say disagree, but I'd say, I think you could come to our schools and you'd actually see lots of evidence of teacher voice, and you'd see reasons why people are there. On instruction, teachers are deeply engaged in what the instructional game plan is. We're huge believers in content teams. We're huge believers in teachers being leaders in the school, whether that's in the form of grade level chairs, teachers, but as grade level chairs, teachers as content team leaders. So we do more training and professional development for teachers than we do, and teacher leaders right now, just in sheer numbers nationally, than we do for school leaders. Like, we're training more people who are teacher leaders than we are training school leaders. Second thing I would say on this, I think there's a lot of good, the book cites a lot of good examples and stories around, why people leave and their frustrations. I think we're missing out on more questioning of why are the people staying, what's making them stay. And if you look at our teachers right now, just shy of 90% of teachers in KIPP schools, because we survey this every year because we need to know at the school level and network-wide, first of all, does your school value teaching? Does KIPP value teaching? Just under 90%, yes. Now, I'd like it to be over 90%. But do you value the profession of teaching, which really matters? People feel, do you value my role? Would you recommend would you recommend this place to another person to work? Is this a place you would speak highly of to others? Just under 90%. So I think we're doing some things well enough to know that this is the way teachers feel. And I think some of that, when I talk about some of these practices, content teams, grade level chairs, people feeling that voice, are eminently shareable across all kinds of schools. The one thing I would say that I think we've also learned, and I want to put it out there because I don't think it's spoken to as explicitly, leadership really matters. And no matter what you want to think, teachers want strong leadership, and they are happier in our schools where we have good leadership. And we could have a hope or a wish that wouldn't be relevant. But the reality is, when we see our most dissatisfied teachers who feel they have the least amount of voice, who want to head out the door as soon as they can, it generally correlates with dissatisfaction with the person leading the school. And so we do overinvest in the development of leaders to lead our schools because their tenure, the longer they're with us, higher student satisfaction, higher teacher satisfaction, higher academic outcomes, all correlates with the tenure and success of our leaders. And so I would just emphasize, because I think it may be underappreciated, when we have strong leaders, teachers are happier, not less happy. And so huge believers in teacher voice. Great leaders create mechanisms for teacher voice. They also make a lot of tough decisions that teachers want them to make. And when I visit our schools, if I hear built-up frustration, sometimes it's, you know what, people aren't making decisions that need to get made, and that really affect my working conditions, really affect my ability to get my job done, and I'd like to see, you know, that kind of leadership exhibited. So, huge believer. Last thing I just say, to credit to the book, I thought Rick and Hallie did a really nice job describing different models. There, and I may not characterize it correctly, but there's, you know, the union model, there's what they called a co-op model, and then there's a collaborative model. And I would put KIPP in the camp of a collaborative model. And I think, again, we are closely all the time asking, how do our teachers feel? Are they satisfied? Do they feel respected? Do they feel appreciated? Do they have the time to work together that they need to plan for their kids? And I think great schools need to do this regardless of school type.
Fair enough, thanks.
Can I just
please.
add one thing? One of the great things about KIPP is it's incredibly transparent, right? It's got data on everything. My reading of that data was a 26% turnover at KIPP schools, and which is higher than in the traditional public schools. And yet 90% are saying they feel valued. So how does that all fit together?
It's a great manager question. So I'd like to have lower turnover. So we'd like to get that above, well, we're returning above 80%. There's a second piece of that, which is a reality of ours, which is we're a fast-growing network. Just to be real, we've been growing a lot. So our teachers are moving around a lot, including into leadership roles. So we do lose 6 or 7% of our teachers a year to KIPP, but to another opportunity at KIPP. And that's partly the nature of opening new schools. It's just a reality. But
that's in addition to the 26%, I think, right?
Well, it depends on the school, but no, we are. Yes, it would be an addition. So but if you got there, we'd be at, you know, over 80% of our folks are with us the next year, who are with us, but they're in different roles. So I'm just adding to I'm just adding the 6 or 7 to that number. And then the last thing I'd say, the reason I think it's really important to look at this from a management standpoint is I don't think there's a lot of good data out there, at least that I get my hands on, that talks about how do teachers in the schools actually feel about what they're doing. So a question could be, where is the intersection between saying, okay, if we had 90% of the people back, but the dissatisfaction rate was much lower, we'd be having to look at that. And so all I would say is, like, I don't get to look at a lot of data that says, in schools that have, if you looked at another set of schools that look, they've got 5 points better satisfaction in these schools over here. I would want to know, how do the teachers in those schools answer questions that really speak to what they feel about teacher voice? Because I've been in a lot of schools where people are staying and feel completely disempowered, and it doesn't become a productive environment. So I just think it's a fuller picture of data we would need to draw conclusions.
We could spend a lot more time on the teacher voice issue, collective bargaining. Let me just ask one real quick question of Rick, and then we'll move on to your other major theme, which is socioeconomic integration, so we can have time for other folks to ask their questions. Going back to Al Shanker's initial conception, the notion that charter schools would be free of school district regulations and collective bargaining provisions seems to be sort of central to the notion of experimentation, innovation, and even sort of ownership and voice. Right, you're empowering people to do new things in what had been a sort of heavily bureaucratic environment in many places. How do you reconcile those two things? Your sort of eagerness to have voice through collective bargaining, and yet the need to be at some distance from bargaining provisions in order to generate the freedom that is about charter schools.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, and just to be clear, so Al Shanker was for charter schools that would be unionized.
Right.
And the question is, how can you reconcile that with flexibility? And I think we see lots of examples, and we cite examples in the book of unionized charter schools that are quite flexible. So for example, we talk about the Amber Charter School in New York City. Its contract is 20 pages long. It has what they call a thin contract. So they're dealing with the basics. They want to make sure teachers are protected, but they don't get into as much detail as the New York City contract, which is in excess of 200 pages. So it is possible to have the flexibility on the one hand and meet the needs of a particular school, and also ensure that teachers have that right to collectively bargain. I mean, one of Shanker's points, which I think is borne out by the research, is that in order for teachers to really experiment and try new things, they need to feel safe. They need to feel as though they won't be fired at the first instance unfairly. And so having those due process protections, having the voice that comes with collective bargaining was incredibly important for him in order to experiment. He thought that was important.
Okay. You want to respond at all, or?
No.
Okay. So I want to move on to this other important issue that you and Hallie raised, Rick, which is socioeconomic integration. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences and have you respond, Richard. They write in their book, because separate schools for rich and poor are rarely equal, the explicit targeting of at-risk students in economically segregated schools weakens the potential of charters to promote social mobility. And the racial and ethnic balkanization of students in many charter schools undermines the critical aim of fostering social cohesion and good citizenship. KIPP deliberately fills its schools with disadvantaged students, mostly of color. So how do you react to Rick and Hallie?
So I'm going to start with, there's a bunch I agree with in the book. So you should read the book if you think it's a good book. And so I just want to start, there's actually a research base that Rick cites that makes sense to me. So he says, in schools with higher socioeconomic students and families who are integrated, but higher, a mix with higher economic resources, research says the students attend class more, do their homework more, graduate more, and there's less mobility. So I'm going to be the last person to say those are bad things. That makes sense. Let me just say, from a KIPP standpoint, our mission has been to go to those communities where kids have had the least chance to climb this mountain to college, climb a mountain to life of choice in America. And so if you look at where we're going, whether it's North St. Louis or South Dallas, or the Bronx, or East LA, it is true they tend to be more racially homogenous, not in every neighborhood, but more economically homogenous, right? That is, and we are, in spite of that, I would make the case, the things that really that Rick talks about. Not every single piece I want to acknowledge from Rick, but the big things of the benefits being children are going to school more, attending more often, doing their homework, graduating at higher rates, and having less mobility. We're actually trying to do that in our context. And as Rick said, we put all our data out there so you can look at how that's actually playing out. But that is literally what we are trying to do, in spite of, I think Rick would say, the odds being harder. And that's why the research is saying these schools. So I think this is a big case of end, which is, I think creating integrated schools is a great thing. I think it's awesome. And I think there are examples in the book of people doing it that I think are terrific. I think what we're doing is awesome. And I think they can both coexist. I will say one thing, just because people come out here and make sure they're not bored. Let me just put out something that I think will be provocative. I actually think there's a big tension. So if you said, how is this going to play out in the next 10 years? I think the reality is, if there's a push for charters overall, of which we are a part, the push I would say that is out there right now is to say, we want you to be more community-based. We want you to be more neighborhood-focused. We'd like to have your schools be more connected to a specific location where families can actually, it's free, open enrollment, walk up the door. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing at all. But I would say if there's a big push right now That's where the big questions are coming. I think they're healthy. What people are saying is, look, would you at KIPP or otherwise would you open a school in this neighborhood? What's exciting, all in all, about the picture, why I'm optimistic, versus 10 years ago. 10 years ago, if you were, a KIPP school leader or one of the early people doing this work, you were scrambling to find a space. Let me just tell you, partly, how did this movement get going? People are like, where can I find a building to open a school? And so you would find a church basement, and so that was the grand strategy. To be real, the grand strategy is finding a space to open a school to help our kids begin this journey. I think now more and more in communities across the country, people are saying to us, we want you to be part of a citywide strategy. So in St. Louis, we want you in North St. Louis. We actually not just we'd like you to partner with us to be in this facility that we had mothballed, that we'd given up. We'd given up on this neighborhood having a school. In Houston, Texas, there is a partnership with the school district there where they're saying, look, we really want you to open up schools inside buildings we've got already to serve whole neighborhoods that we're not doing a good job with. And so it's really exciting to see folks like us being asked to be part of that overall strategic solution. But I would say as part of that, in general, the push has not been to say, we want you to be part of an integration plan. It's been more, we actually need good schools in these parts of the city. And instead of you scrambling to find where you're going to be, we'd actually like you to sit down with us and actually figure out where do we want you to grow. And I think there's going to be more and more of that in the coming years.
That's interesting because those of you who watched the evolution of the charter movement from its inception 2 decades ago will know that certainly for a long period of time, and still to a certain extent, but certainly early on, there was dramatic tension between the two sectors, and that seems to be dissipating, which I think is a really important sort of trend generally in metropolitan education. Rick, let me just ask you one follow-up on the socioeconomic integration. You marshal, as you have in earlier books, you and Hallie marshal very compelling evidence about the value of integrated schools, and I think everybody would agree with the goal. How do you envision that happening, however, in a place like Washington, where east of the river in Anacostia, the housing is totally segregated, and it would be very hard, I think, frankly, at this point, to get large numbers of folks coming across the city that direction to go to school. You might be able to go the other way, but it begins to feel a little bit like sort of busing. And how do we reconcile the sort of fraud experience the nation had, 2, 3, and 4 decades ago around that with your admirable goal?
Well, so first of all, let's put it on the table. We're not talking about compulsory busing.
I think it's important.
We're talking today about charter schools, which are schools of choice. No one's being forced to do anything. Secondly, there are places in D.C. and in Newark and other parts of the country where it is not possible to create economically integrated schools. And so that's just a reality. Having said that, there are lots of, because there is gentrification in a number of urban areas and changing demographics, there are new possibilities for integration. There was one study done of New York City public schools that found that half of the community school districts in New York City could support racially and economically integrated schools. And yet it's very much not part of the conversation. Even though there is this very, very powerful evidence that one of the probably one of the best things you could do for a low-income student is give her a chance to go to an economically integrated school where she is likely to be surrounded by peers who are academically engaged, expect to go on to college, supported by a group of parents who are likely to be in a position to volunteer in class and make sure that the school is running well, and where for those first 2 sets of reasons, teachers, great teachers are attracted. I guess I would differ with Richard a little bit on the trajectory here. There's now a newly formed national coalition of diverse charter schools. There seems to be excitement in a number of school districts for trying an alternative model where students of different backgrounds are coming together. Even white parents are now acknowledging that diversity is a strength, that if they want their kids to be able to navigate and thrive in a 21st century workforce, they need to avoid being in all white settings, all affluent settings. And so I think the wave of the future, as we see our nation becoming more diverse, is greater demand for schools that are going to reflect that diversity.
Fair enough. Charters have been, under most state laws, have been prohibited from admitting students through selection criteria, so open seating until they're over they're oversubscribed,
Yeah.
and then using lotteries. If we move away from that, do you worry that you might open the door, which you'd have to do to a certain extent to create the integrated environments that you're hoping for, right? Are you worried that this might lead to some exclusionary admissions practices, and hence more segregation and not less? Because even with open admission policies, some charters are already putting their finger on the admission scale, as you point out in the book, for both good reasons and bad. You say, for example, that E.L. Haynes here in D.C. deliberately recruits to create a diverse applicant pool. A good thing. While Greenwood Charter School in Philadelphia makes applications available only for those who attend a one-day open house held at a private golf club in the city's suburbs. Is there tension here?
Yeah, no, we advocate weighted lotteries of the type that are used by High Tech High in California, the Denver School of Science and Technology, weighted lotteries to encourage diversity. And so it's very possible for a state legislature to create financial incentives for the creation of those types of integrated charter schools that use the lottery, that weight the lottery in order to encourage integration, and to provide a huge disincentive to recruiting country clubs. Right now, the charter school laws are written in many states in a way that advantages charter schools that have what Rick Hess at AEI calls kind of the highest octane mix of low income and minority students. That is encouraging schools that are going to maximize poverty concentrations. And I think in most cases, that is not a recipe for success.
So just a couple of things. So I just want to emphasize, I just can't agree more with the fact that I think creating these schools is a great thing. So I really do think there's so much merit to them. And I think it's exciting to see the models emerge. And there are examples in the book of them. Denver School of Science, these are fantastic schools. Second, I would say I really do disagree with where the movement is in terms of, there's an association of these schools, and it's fantastic, but I would say just in terms of dynamics right now, in terms of the overall, this is my day job, like what is the dynamic out there? There is much less people screaming to say this is where the movement needs to go relative to we need to go to community-based, open enrollment, integrated into the city system model. If I were to predict, at least, and I can't predict 20 years out, but next 5 years, the efforts to try to actually be saying, no, we'd want to be able to control for something different than that, I actually think they're going to be more difficult. Why I think the book's important, actually, to make the case. But I actually think it's going to be more difficult. And, living where I live in New York right now, the school my children go to, it's a traditional public school. It's actually been mandated to stop recruiting for diversity when that was actually the intent. So I would say the larger wins right now are towards asking folks like charters to serve specific purposes. And in fact, partly it's been fueled by this notion that, well, you guys have been trying to get special kids, you're creaming, so we're not going to let you do that anymore. You're going to have to go and be a local community-based school and take the kids who show up. So I'm just putting it out there because, I'd like to think there's going to be more wind for this. I think it's going to be harder. I think a lot of parents do want it, so I think there is going to be demand for it. Let me just say one other thing in terms of, why I think the big point here is a big optimistic one. If you go back to Al Shanker's original vision that charters can be centers of innovation, I would make the case, probably no one is more uniquely suited to try to prove out this model than a charter. And so it is an exciting opportunity to say, couldn't we, folks in the movement be the ones to actually show that this can be done, that there actually be parent demand for it, that people want kids to be able to go and have an integrated experience, and for people to develop new approaches. And while it's not a part of the book, I would argue in the smarter charter in the future, I think there are going to be opportunities for charters to be leading innovators on a whole bunch of fronts. Serving special needs children, creating new schools for kids who are facing tremendous challenge, juvenile justice. I actually think the opportunities for innovation in the movement are huge. This is a great example. But I think moving beyond what people have typically thought of as the movement into new opportunities is going to be a big part of the next decade for sure.
That's really helpful.
So the reason I'm more optimistic is you don't have access to this information, but
Yeah.
but our sales haven't been enormous yet. When this book takes off, we expect to see a sea change in attitudes.
Got it.
Who's got a question? And if you could stand, give us your name and affiliation, and please be very brief because we don't have much time. And also, the first 5 people who raise their hand get a book. Sorry, you're number 6.
Yeah. Michael Lomax, President of the United Negro College Fund, a member of the KIPP board. So,
Plan.
okay. I just want to know, prior to the founding of charters, low-income kids of color who wanted a quality education in a traditional public school had to leave their communities and go across town to affluent white neighborhoods to get a good education. And if too many of them went over there, they stopped letting them, or the affluent whites started moving out. I think putting the onus, I just want to understand from Rit, when is the responsibility for socioeconomic integration going to fall on affluent whites to take some leadership on, as opposed to low-income parents of color or the schools that are serving them?
That's a great question.
It is a great question, and the models that I like most are ones like those found in Hartford, Connecticut, where you have long waiting lists of white middle-class people in the suburbs who are trying to get into magnet schools in Hartford. So the travel burden is placed, in that case, on white families who are oftentimes in a better position to provide that transportation on their own. But there are examples of schools located in very tough neighborhoods, with boarded-up housing nearby, that can attract middle-class families if what's at the end of the car ride or bus ride is a high-quality, innovative education. And so there, for example, in Hartford, they have a Montessori school that's in a deeply distressed neighborhood that has strong white and upper middle-class demand because of that quality program. Hartford also has a program where the burden is on the low-income families to go to the suburban schools. And there's a long waiting list for that, too, so I don't want to cut that type of program off. I think the movement should be in both directions.
Richard, do you think that charter schools, high-achieving charter schools like most of KIPP's, could be de facto magnet schools in this sense?
Yeah, I think, again, this is an opportunity for charter schools. I think if you create great schools, the opportunity to attract people from all walks of life are going to be higher. I think the number one thing parents are going to want to know is this school going to deliver what I want for my child? I think Michael makes a good point, though, which is probably more often than not, the assumption is people are going to want to go to the, to the, I don't know DC Walnut, but across the river, that's the assumption is if you're going to make this work, it's got to be across the river. And let me just say one thing that, because it, again, on the big point here, I think there's a really good opportunity to create these great schools. Practical reality, why this has to be an end. There are, 110,000 kids living in Dallas. I forget the name of the highway, but it's basically the southern part of Dallas. You go to St. Louis, where we're in St. Louis, it's past, there's actually a wall. I couldn't believe it. It's like Berlin or something. They call it the Baumar or something. It's this wall where you go into North St. Louis. It is an end, but let me say this. The need for good schools in those communities is immense. And so I just would not want anyone to think that we shouldn't be doing both things, but aggressively expanding the number of great schools in North St. Louis. Because the number one thing right now we will hear from families there is they want more good schools tomorrow. And so the last thing I want us to do is slow down. Every time we have a school with 500 or 600 kids in North St. Louis, those are 500 or 600 kids who would have not otherwise had access to a good school. And while it's really important that, many models get created, I would say like the growth of what we're doing is a really, really good thing. I want to make sure I'm being clear about that. And for thousands of kids in that, if they don't have access to that, now, is that a magnet? I think it's, every parent I meet, they don't even care. Like, I would say this, like, we get caught up in, like, is it a charter? Is it a magnet? Whatever. Parents, the parents I meet, they don't even talk that way. They're just like, I love this school. And why isn't there another one? Or why isn't there an elementary school? So we get in our own heads on that.
If I can add
Please.
something on this too. And that's why I'm glad the KIPP is there in those neighborhoods. I would say, however, that I think part of the reason, there's good evidence to suggest that part of the reason that KIPP is succeeding in those neighborhoods where traditional public schools haven't is that the same dynamic is going on as goes on in socioeconomically integrated schools. So why do we care whether rich kids sit next to poor kids? Well, there are these three reasons I talked about before. You want to have peers who are going to encourage achievement. You want to have parents who are actively involved. And you want to be able to create the environment in which you can get great teachers. And KIPP is able to do that, it seems to me, in part because you have the most motivated families, most motivated low-income families in that neighborhood who bother to fill out the application and who take the time to go to the KIPP open house, find out more about it. Then you have kind of a further element of self-selection where you can imagine two families going to this KIPP open house, hearing about the great programs, but also the tremendous rigor involved, right? You're going to go to school on Saturdays, you're going to get a lot more homework, and the kids sitting in the audience are saying, well, this isn't for me. But one parent says, okay, we don't have to go to KIPP. And the other parent says, no, this is important. Your education is incredibly important. We're going. So that creates a positive peer environment in KIPP, the way you have a positive peer environment in socioeconomically integrated schools, because you have a group of kids a subset of low-income kids who are particularly motivated. I know from reading Jay Matthews' terrific book on KIPP that parents need to sign a contract. I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time, at least, they had to sign a contract for KIPP schools to say, we're going to read to our kids most nights. We're going to make sure they do their homework. I think that's a great idea. But that type of program may discourage certain parents from signing up and attract a more relatively advantaged parent population, the people who are more likely to show up and help out. And because KIPP has this self-selected group of students, and because they can attract these parents, you're able to get stronger teachers because the working conditions are going to be better. Then on top of that, there's this issue about who leaves KIPP and who comes in to replace students. And we talk about that in the book, as you know. And so at KIPP schools, there are about a third of the kids leave. And that's true of all high poverty schools, right? I mean, there's just a lot of mobility in high poverty schools. But what happens in KIPP schools is that fewer students are brought in as new students compared to traditional high poverty public schools. Well, that's a tremendous advantage in terms of that peer environment, because you have a less disruptive system, and you have a group of peers who are, these are the survivors of a rigorous program who then over time are reinforcing the positive behavior in that school. So all of these things are likely to contribute to KIPP's success, and I don't mean this as I think the KIPP success is genuine. What I worry about is the lesson that some people take from this. There's a profoundly right-wing lesson that some people will take from KIPP and say, well, KIPP works. I mean, they conquered segregation, they conquered poverty. They don't have a union, so maybe that's the key to success here. When in fact, most of the evidence seems to suggest that KIPP is having a positive impact for the same reason that socioeconomically integrated traditional public schools have a positive impact.
Can I?
Yes, I can't not let him talk. I can't not let him.
So let me say, and I won't take it. So this is where it gets fun. So I would just say, a couple things. What Rick just shared, I would say, is the exact reason why the pressure to not create integrated schools, but to be neighborhood, community-based schools, open enrollment, is what it is. So I just want to be like, if we want to have our cake, it needed too. The reason people are saying to us, you need to be community-based, no selection process, is that. And so when we say, yes, we'll do that, then we shouldn't be critiqued for saying, yes, we will do that. Because,
yes,
and let me say something,
one
of the second things is that is the pressure, that's the argument all the people are giving. Second thing, when we prove that kids in a predominantly minority, poor environment can succeed, even when we had to do all the things people said you could never pull off, then we'll know that kids can do it. Because there's a pervasive underpinning here. And let me just say something, the integrated schools, if we go do that thing, I'm telling you what the argument will be. You have the most special poor kids in these integrated schools. They're not the poor kids who don't want to travel to integrated schools. They're not the poor kids whose families are going to be uncomfortable in a school that's integrated. And then we're going to be back to where we are. I guarantee it. So I believe in the integration schools. I think it's a beautiful thing. But if we want to make this, all those are the arguments that they keep making against us. And so I say, let's grow. And you should encourage our growth. Because you should say, you know what? If you could get to 20 schools in DC, then there's no way people could say these are just special kids. I'd say happily, just let us do it.
And just to be clear, my argument is different than that, right? So I'm not saying that the KIPP's success isn't genuine. I think it is genuine with the subset of students who are involved.
But no, let me say, we have to backfill now, which is great. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think it's a learning, so we should backfill. In New York, we're backfilling.
Meaning
And
take
kids in upper grades.
and filling open vacant seats through attrition.
Particularly at upper grades. So this is something people pointed out. And I would just say it's great that people have said, we think you should be just like any other school, like a traditional school, taking kids upper grades. So we do that, and when we do that, and if our kids succeed, I hope, again, it's one more taking out of the yes buts that the kids we serve are not special kids. Because underneath this all is a belief that only special kids of color could do this. And these are not special kids of color. These are kids of color in poor communities who are proving it can be done. And so happily we will evolve, but it will be probably less in the direction you're describing.
The woman with a red scarf. Sorry. Is that a scarf you have on? Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to take that line of thought.
What's your name?
Oh,
Sorry, what's your
my
name?
name's
Who you with?
Eliza Durana. I work at HUD in the Promise Neighborhood Initiative, or Promise Homes Initiative.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And I was wondering, we've been talking about charter schools in a vacuum, and I'm wondering how communities can sort of encourage smarter charters, but without doing that at the expense of traditional schools, and to think about, what happens to students that still remain in traditional schools, and how how also can we think about education or charters in reference to housing policy and sort of the intersection of the two? Because often I think that's where the mobility argument gets interesting.
Yeah. So one of the things that Hallie and I have found in writing this book is that that we've dissatisfied people on both the right and the left. So the pro-charter folks are concerned when we raise criticisms, but there's also a legitimate concern on the left that, you know, if charters, if you create socioeconomically integrated, smarter charters, that will leave the rest of the system worse off, marginally worse off, because you concentrate poverty further among the remaining schools. And that's a real issue that we grappled with at length, but in the end concluded that providing a net plus in positive integrated environments for low-income kids was worth it, and that it could create a virtuous cycle in which, over time, more middle-class families consider using public schools rather than using private schools or moving to the suburbs, and in that way would change the socioeconomic mix of the public schools over time, and that those two benefits were worth the costs, the marginal increase in poverty concentrations at other schools. But the ultimate goal is, you know, we're a middle-class country. We ought to find ways to give many, many more kids a chance to go to high-quality, socioeconomically integrated schools. So, and Richard, just to make clear on the criticism, though, I'm thrilled that KIPP is providing the opportunities to low-income kids. My worry is the right-wing interpretation that KIPP defeated segregation. Segregation doesn't matter, and I think you would acknowledge that it's different to run a school where you happen to educate all the kids, all the low-income kids who live in that neighborhood, than one where students select in. That's the difference. Right?
So I might just connecting to that and the question, I would just say, you know, one of the things that I think is really important to put out there. So people will, and I think it's referenced in the book. Rick, you can tell me if I got this right. But you know, people will say, not KIPP, but people will say about KIPP, you are a no excuses school. You don't think poverty matters. I've yet to see a quote where I've said that. I've yet to see a quote where Mike Feinberg or Dave Levin, the founders, had said, you know, poverty really doesn't matter. And so I think it's important in these moments to say, look, like, is poverty a material factor in the lives of our kids? And does it have a major impact on their opportunities to climb this mountain, to college, to a life of choice? It's massive. It's massive. In fact, as Michael Lomax knows, one of our board members, the last few years, we're now grappling with, we started as a middle school model, now we're K-12. What have we discovered? Poverty becomes a major factor once you want to go to college, right? So I just want to emphasize, no one at KIPP has ever put this out. And I would say increasingly it's important that leaders in our movement don't let ourselves get articulated or presented that way, because this is not the way we see it. It's not the experience we have in our schools. Second thing, you know, there's this notion of no excuses schools, which again, no one, you know, in our network has said, oh, what is our school model? It's a no excuses model. That's become a catchword and has many connotations. We have high expectations. That's been one of our pillars. We have high expectations of our teachers. We have high expectations of our leaders. We have high expectation of our KIPPsters. We believe in high expectations, and we believe in tons of support. And we think these are one of these things where people want them to be ors, but it's an absolute end. You can have high expectations and support. Anyone in this room who's a parent is constantly trying to figure out how to do that for your own child. High expectations and lots of support to meet them. And so I really, again, thinking about moving, the title here, Moving Beyond the Wars, we do have high expectations for everyone at KIPP. Great organizations do. And then we figure out what does it take for people to meet them. Teachers, we want to make sure you have lots of professional development. We want to make sure you have time for planning. School leaders, we want to make sure we create an opportunity for you to learn and grow on the job. We want you to get coaching so you can be successful. But we have high expectations. And so I think it's, I also want to make sure we don't get stuck with labels that are not the ones that we have asked for. And these are two ones that I really like. So we are not people who believe poverty doesn't matter. We are not people who believe that these are no excuses schools. And let me lastly say, we're a learning organization. So when you look at our history, there are so many things that we've had to learn the hard way. We used to have, if you looked at what Mike and Dave did in their first year, which is well documented, the way they handled high expectations and behavior, they would die right now to think that that was them. But it was what they were doing their first year in terms of how they handled discipline in the early days. If people looked at middle schools we thought could get us all the way there, we were naive. That's why we've gotten K-12. Lastly, just again to put this out there because it's really important, it was 6 or 7 years ago we stepped back with our teams and said, we're really concerned that the whole world is focused on test scores. And any organization in the world that focuses on a single number, a single metric, history would tell you, whether it's a business or a nonprofit, will get into trouble. So let's create a balance, in the old world, a balanced scorecard. Let's think about what do we think. So we ask ourselves 6 questions when we think about what makes a healthy KIPP school. We say, are we serving kids who really need us? Are they staying with us year after year? Because we can't help them climb the mountain if they're not still with us. Are they making the annual academic growth they need to make? Are they climbing the mountain to and then through college? And then are we doing this in a way that's sustainable for our people? Are we doing this in a way that's sustainable financially? And Rick, I do appreciate the credit here. We are among, I think, the most transparent organizations out there. Meaning, you can dig into our data on all those questions all the time, but we think it's an important contribution to the larger good. But we are not simply about showing that you can get good test scores. And I think 5 years from now, probably that set of questions will have evolved because we'll keep learning. But let's make sure we don't get pinned, or charters in general get pinned with articulations of a world that none of us think really exists.
By the way, on the question of no excuses and dealing with poverty, the new KIPP high school here in DC has a full-blown health clinic in it. The man, the mic, and a book. That's what I want. The mic or the book? Okay.
Hi, my name's Dave Price, a retired urban educator and journalist who spends my time now with seeking out free lunches and free books and free advice. Last night I was at AAI and heard 4 speakers there, including Rick Hess, you mentioned. Really good ideas. Today we come here and hear really good ideas. And yet we continue to see schools not succeeding in urban areas, okay? Well, that means there's problems, obviously, and there's a multitude of them. But to both Richards on the stage, what do you see as the 2 or 3 biggest problems and we'll separate the 2 because I believe they can be separated, I may be wrong. We have very successful schools, and we have very unsuccessful schools in America, and most of those are concentrated in urban or poor areas. So what are the 2 or 3, or you have 4 if you want, biggest problems in some kind of impromptu priority order that's keeping us from being successful in those schools?
I mean, not surprisingly, I would say that the fact that we concentrate poverty in our public schools in a way that other nations don't is keeping us down. So everyone points to Finland, right? Finland is the big success story. And there are lots of reasons why they're a special situation. But one of the notable facts about Finland is that not only does it have a very low poverty rate, but the poor kids it does have go to middle-class schools. There was a list of, I think, 32 OECD countries, and Finland had the lowest level of economic segregation of their schools. This isn't on the radar screen. I mean, the Obama administration, which I was very excited about coming in, has really not tackled this question. In part, I think, for the reasons you articulated, Tom, that people automatically go to Boston circa 1975 But we've learned a lot about how to integrate schools through choice, through magnets, through charters. And so I think that would be number one. And number two would, again, not a surprise, would be that we need to find better ways to give teachers say in schools that will help us solve these very difficult problems.
So I don't have anything really to disagree with what Rick just shared. I would say, and I think it's a big challenge for us to think about going forward. So why will this keep happening? So first, I actually think we have a massive human capital issue, and it's multifaceted. Well, actually, first let me say, this is incredibly hard. That's the first thing. So why do we still have it? Anyone who thinks like there's a pixie dust out there to create great schools for kids, like it just, we've never found it. We're still learning. So I think it's a reminder of the degree of difficulty. Second, I think there's a major ongoing, and it looks like in the future, human capital issue. So if you look at the big districts right now, LAUSD, John Daisy, I was hearing the other day, the number of people coming into the teaching profession is plummeting, actually plummeting. The size of programs that would create teachers for a city like Los Angeles, they don't even know where the teacher is going to come from in 5 to 10 years. So I look at this and I think, who's going to be in these schools? What preparation will they have? When they're in them, what sort of training, on-the-job training and support and guidance and professional development are they going to get? Who's going to be leading these schools? And so you add all that up, it is not a surprise to me that you'll have lots and lots of schools not hit the ball out of the park because schools are made up of people. And if you have lots of people in there who are underprepared, feel disinvested in, maybe this was not a job of choice, the path to leadership is not clear and not well developed, you're going to have schools that struggle. Given how hard it is, I think anyone who takes the eye off the ball and like where's the human capital going to come from to teach it's the most important and hardest job in the world, and then lead these schools. I think it's huge. Let me say one other thing that I actually do think, again, we have an advantage on. I'll just declare it. We have stability, and it's funny we're talking about stability. My board it's evolved somewhat, but Michael Lomax, I mean, it's a stable. I'm beginning my 10th year. It's a stable board. I don't have as much as they're provocative and they push. Board members don't come in and say we need to change everything we do, and they don't do it every 2 years. And in large systems where we have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of kids in America, we actually have challenges where boards come in, they change regularly. And I think if you were inside that system, you would begin to wonder, like, how the heck do we get something done? Because if every 2 years they say, well, now here's the new mandate, we're going to get rid of these technology, we're going to do this, and now we're going to do these kinds of schools, and now we're going to change feeder patterns, and now we're going to do this. I actually think you will not attract the right people, you will not keep the right people, and on some level, you're going to have an environment that just feels like a gerbil or a hamster in a hamster cage, because there's a sense of a system that doesn't progress. It just lurches from one silver bullet to another with lots of instability at the most senior levels.
So is the logical solution to the lack of stability in traditional public school systems to replace them with charter-only models where we're getting close to in New Orleans?
I think this is Rick's next book. I don't know what the policy answer is to this. I just know I actually don't have a crystal ball on how to solve this. I would say, I just think that when I look at what's happening in so many large districts where we have hundreds of thousands of children right now, that lack of constancy is a major issue. I don't know maybe you've got thoughts on that.
Well, it's been a challenge that's been around for a long time. To answer your question, Tom, I think we have heard certain people, particularly on the right, talk about completely demolishing the traditional public school system and replacing it with an all-charter system. And I think that we've lost sight of the incredible value that charter schools can offer when we make those suggestions, because here's the opportunity to start schools from scratch, to really try innovative things, and then share those lessons. But as soon as the movement becomes about let's replace the traditional public school system, then I think there's no, there's no political appetite for that, and it'll hurt the charter school movement. I mean, one of the things that Hallie and I were discouraged by is that, we were looking at the original model, that charter schools would work together with traditional public schools, and how inspiring that possibility was. And almost all the research is not on what are the best lessons from KIPP, what are the best lessons from other charter schools. It's all about who does better. Do charters do better, or traditional public schools do better? That's what the vast majority of the charter school research consists of, which is completely beyond the point. It's supposed to be about what lessons can be imparted. And as soon as you get into that competitive model, then we get back to the charter school wars that we're trying to get beyond.
I agree that I would say this. I think it's counterproductive, this whole, we look at our results versus yours. I think it's a really counterproductive trend. And the people, I just want to emphasize, the KIPPsters, the big KIPPsters, teachers and leaders, they didn't get into this to, beat the district. They got into this to change kids' lives. They stay in it to change kids' lives. And if given the chance, I mean, all of them want to say, how is this whole city going to be better for kids by the time my work is done? And I think, I'm optimistic that there is going to be more of that sharing, because I see it. Now, I wish it was everywhere. And where it doesn't happen is sometimes these people have gotten into what I think sometimes are stupid wars, instead of thinking about these big opportunities. So.
Just as a footnote to Rick's comment about lack of lesson learning across sectors, I was in Achievement Prep charter school here recently. It's one of the 2 or 3 highest performing charters in the city. And the leaders of the school suggested that the school was built from the ground up, essentially using bricks and mortar, if you will, drawn from other charter schools all over the country. In other words, taking best practices to build a new model from scratch, and they built an incredibly interesting, innovative school that's doing very well. Point being that it would be nice if that were to happen across sectors. Yeah, we have a couple more minutes.
Hi, my name is Lauren Phillips, and I work for the Seed Foundation, which supports three boarding schools for students in 3 different states. I was wondering if either of you could comment on the high levels of attrition that we see, especially among students with disabilities and English language learners in different charter schools, and if that could possibly derive from the fact that many charters, including KIPP, are focused on college for all students. So does that college for every single child approach to schools maybe risk alienating some students who, for whatever reason, do not feel that they're college bound?
Great question.
Let me first just say, I think attrition is it is so important for us to be focused on it. So I just think it's a great question. It is our second essential question. Are our kids staying with us? And I want to emphasize, it's about having a life with choices. College, right now in America, full stop, college maximizes choice. So anyone who makes these arguments otherwise, there's no data to support it. Just in terms of what the guidance we're giving our KIPPsters. We've focused on our attrition. We've gotten it down, almost, I'm not good at percentages, from down to now in the 11% range from 16 years ago, and we want to get it below 10, which again would be given where we're working, really, really good. I've never heard that be cited, and our research evaluation team looks at a lot of stuff as a contributor or a force in doing it. I think we do actually have to be really careful that our schools, which are preparing kids to climb this mountain to a life with choice, recognize that we do not want to be dictating to young kids, we want to make sure they're aspirational, and that's what's not happening in schools where our kids go. But by the time when you're 16 or 17, that's when, based on where you are and what you've accomplished and what you like, we should be providing really good career counseling and not just thinking about, if you're not going to college, you're not a KIPPster, because you are. I've not heard that as one of the reasons. I will say, just so people hear this, so what have we found leads to higher attrition? One of the biggest things we found is that in schools that have low attrition, first of all, they're just absolutely obsessed with keeping every kid. So we now have 20 schools this year with attrition under 5%, which is unheard of. It's better than my kids' schools, right? Like, in just unheard of. They are just obsessed with keeping every kid, no matter what. The second thing I would say is we've learned is that when we lose schools that lose kids, if you sit with a group of adults in a room and say, you know, what happened? No one knows the kid. No one knew the kid. And in schools where they don't have that happen, people know what's going on. And so, and those relationships are what it's about. So, and it doesn't have to be their teacher, it doesn't have to be a counselor. It could be, but it could be a coach. It could be the school secretary. But where relationships are really formed and everyone's on top of that, you don't have kids walk out, in many cases against, you know, what's probably in their best interest, only because there wasn't that adult, that caring adult who said, hey, let's talk about what you're thinking through. So that is the number one thing we've learned, absolute will and commitment, and then really knowing where kids are at risk and making sure there's a caring adult who's got a relationship to connect with that child and make sure they're thinking it through. And so that's how we've been able to get it down.
I agree with all of that. Can I follow up on one question of the backfilling issue
Yeah.
that you raised before? So in certain districts, it sounds like you're now being required to backfill. Is KIPP interested in kind of voluntarily filling all those slots that open? Presumably, you've got waiting lists of kids who want to get in.
Yeah.
And when a space develops, why not just replace?
Yeah. So I think it's something we have to take up. Again, we're a network, so these are locally grown and managed schools. But I think it's going to be a conversation that's coming up, which is, guys, again, similar to things like this is part of the reality, and you know, I mean, I think one of the big questions here is, if not us, who? So I view it as like any other big moral question. Let's take a look at special needs children. People in the old days, generation 1.0 of charters would say, we don't have the resources, which many times they didn't. They didn't have the money. We don't have the capacity to work with kids with needs. The question, though, is, if not us, who? And I think when people ask that question, they realize, show me all the great schools in this town for our kids with those needs, and they aren't really there. So that's how you end up building that will. So I think it'll be a question that gets taken up.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of those same Charter 1.0 folks who say that it's really not our obligation to serve all kids in the sense as you just described, are also this kind of some of the same folks who want charter schools to replace public schools. So you create this tension whereby you eliminate the safety net, if you will, for lots of different kinds of kids, and some of those folks have not engaged with that reality as fully as they might. Yes, purple scarf. I'm sticking with scarves.
I'm Elizabeth Shore, the Center for the Study of Social Policy. I'm wondering how the issues that we've been discussing relate to the age and stage of the kids' education. That is, does economic integration and other issues play out differently? Especially KIPP has learned by starting with middle schools, going to high schools, and now you're starting earlier and earlier. Is there an intersection here with some of these issues and where the kids start?
In terms of the integration, and how does that connect to age of kids?
And the other issues that we've been talking about.
So I don't have research on like whether there are specific age connections that are most important. I don't presume that it is age specific, but I don't know whether you have research on.
So socioeconomic integration matters at all ages for different reasons. So in the elementary school age, parental involvement is really important. Parents are very involved in terms of helping out the teachers by volunteering in class and being active eyes and ears for the community. And for that reason, it can be very important at the elementary school level. At the middle school and high school level, research suggests that your peers become more important. So elementary kids are trying to impress their parents and their teacher. In middle and high school, they're more about impressing their peers. And so socioeconomic integration is important for that reason. When you look at the research on the effects of socioeconomic integration, Professor Pallardi has results from the high school level. there's this great study in Montgomery County, Maryland, involving elementary school students, which found a very, very positive impact to socioeconomic integration. In that study, which was particularly powerful, students were, families applied for public housing throughout Montgomery County, and the students were tracked. In the western part of the county, the schools are more affluent, and students would benefit from active parents in the school, strong teachers, and some peer influences. In the eastern part of the county, where the schools were higher poverty, students were given more resources. They were getting about $2,000 more per pupil. So the question was, if you're a low-income kid, where would you rather be? In a socioeconomically integrated school that spends less, or a socioeconomically isolated school that spends more? And the power of socioeconomic integration was such that the students in the western part of the county, the more affluent part of the county, did substantially better at the elementary school level. And there are similar studies at high school, so it matters across the board.
Last question. We'll stick with purple. Jeannie Campbell.
Eugenia Kemble, Foundation for Democratic Education, and former assistant to Al Shanker for education issues. I just want to go back to Al for a minute because I do think it's very relevant, and your book, Rick, has made a great contribution. But Al did turn against this movement, and for some very solid political and educational reasons, and the two are tied together. If there's an elephant in the room here, it's the politics of this. And Tom, I hope you'll advocate another discussion because there really needs to be a discussion about that as it relates to education. Anyway, the two things that I wanted you to comment on are, in terms of why Al turned on this, one is that his perception of teacher voice, he thought it was being taken on by the movement because there was an attempt to differentiate it from teacher power, namely the union, and that you could not have, in a highly decentralized setup, the way charters were going to be, a real power if all this voice was so decentralized that teachers could be ignored. That's number one. And number two, and this relates to the integration question that you've talked about. The other reason that Al, I believe, the most powerful reason that he turned against this relates to diversity, but in this sense. It was not committed to standards. And at the point in his political career, he was pushing very hard for this standards movement. And he was afraid that this decentralization impulse that you're talking about, which I'm not so sure is a great way to go, was going to undermine that movement towards standards. And that's not to say that some of these charters don't have high standards. They do. But some of them don't. And so if you have a movement that's as diverse as that in terms of its quality, you can have a situation where that politics of standards, which I really do think we need, the way the Finns and all the others that are outperforming us have, would be undermined. So I hope you could comment on that.
Well, I'm glad you made that point explicitly. We talk about that at length in the book, that when Al Shanker saw that at that point, 88% of charter schools were non-union, he saw that this idea had been hijacked. This beautiful idea to enhance teacher voice had been turned on its head on that question. At the same time, at his last executive committee meeting, he said we need to sort the good charters from the bad charters. So he wasn't throwing the idea out entirely, and that's what that's what Hallie and I are about, is trying to sort the strong charters from those that are more destructive. In terms of teacher power, I think it's possible, even when you have individualized collective bargaining agreements with charter schools, to maintain teacher power by affiliating, the Amber Union can affiliate with the AFT, or some others have affiliated with the NEA. So it's possible to have the customized, specialized collective bargaining agreement tailored to a particular charter school, and also make sure that teachers are part of a national movement to enhance their political voice. So I think both are possible. In terms of the standards, that was an evolution, and Al moved away from charters and towards standards. I think at its best, you would have both. You would have individual experimentation in charter schools with all of those charters held to a common set of standards.
And no doubt he's smiling down on the Common Core state standards today. Join me in thanking Hallie and Rick for a book and for Richard for coming down from New York. A great discussion.